Yeah, this is that's what my chemistry teacher did. He got up in front of the class at the start of the semester, held up the syllabus and went, "You don't need to know this. You don't need to know this. You do need to know this." And basically started ripping pages out of the syllabus that were deemed just irrelevant because that was his only goal to get into the exams. Which, on the one hand, yeah, that worked very well. On the other hand, I needed to train a little bit more concepts on
I really don't like the way it's going. Because I need because at least for the period I had, it was all like history overview writing ones, and then the writing examples when he was teaching you, so expected you to write examples for yourself. But at least for me, I need something streaming to do that first example, and then I can write it around that. Because that's a lot of time if I'm trying to book.
I guess technically I'll probably end up doing more units more often than I need to because stuff like what you're teaching for second units anyway than you need to do two. And technically by the end of the semester I will have done my two required second year units without having ever covered the English.
Are you going to double major?
No, I'm just too interested in like little parts of different
Are
areas.
you planning on doing both then?
See what happens.
You're in second year right now, right?
I think double major would be worthwhile though.
Yeah, it's just like you do that cycle
Yeah.
My issue with double majoring is I have nothing that I want to do enough to make it my double major, and I have too many things I want to give up and do one thing at a time. So I can double major in these 3 units at
What do
once.
you want to do long term when you graduate? No idea?
And in that way, actually, not double majoring isn't better or worse. On the one hand, it would be better picking up, but I know quite a few people who haven't finished their bachelor's arts in uni, and they say, as long as you've actually got the words the letter BA, then you've completed it. No one has double majored in anything.
Yeah. I guess for some people it makes sense.
You never been to Bake Shop?
No.
Oh.
because I make fun of it last week.
Sorry?
Is it because I make fun of it last week?
You all made fun of it last week. Well, you and Zach, who's not here. No, it's because I did this for about 10 minutes, these slides, and then did something else. License something.
Sam, in terms of also synthetic, I'm doing sort of the various things like counterfactual, clarity map, whatever, account and mathematical explanation.
Yeah.
Do I have to then go out and find articles to sort of reference for that counterfactual account, or is it just okay to say the counterfactual account is this?
Oh, you should reference it.
Yeah. So I need to go out and find Lewis's counterfactual account.
You don't have to do much looking. I mean, I've given you the paper and reading it. Paper Causation, 1973, Journal of Philosophy. Yeah.
Looking for explanations and I guessing from photos.
Oh, he's got a paper called The Causal...
Edition 4.
Remember, he's got a paper in his collected works, philosophical papers, on causal explanation.
So it shouldn't be too hard.
It's not hard at all.
Another thing is in your lecture on that, in the slides, what it says is the making a difference is only to do with a negative counterfactual, as in if X hadn't happened, then Y would have happened. But in the lecture, you talk about it as it's the sort of regular thing, counterfactual dependent when it comes to.
It's just regular counterfactual, so I was just focusing on the negative ones because they're the ones that we typically focus on, because the other ones are trivially true.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with things that actually occur.
Right. Cool. Thanks.
Alright, so I did say you could get an attendance mark by coming to this lecture. I'm not going to take the role. Instead, those of you who have missed one and would like an attendance mark, can you please raise your hand?
I'm gonna try.
What's the purpose?
Last week I did.
I don't know that last one.
Just all put up your hands.
Wait,
I'll go through. How about this? I'll go through the list, and I can tell you now if you've missed one or not. Okay, starting from here. As
a computer
I
scientist,
said
I
you'd missed
entirely
at least
understand.
one because I felt like that was the most diplomatic way of putting the point. That way.
Was that pause to your internal laughter, and you went, okay. Just, well,
That was my internal diplomat turning on and going, how do I put this? Alright, Tom, Zach. Yeah, you missed the first one.
that's even worse.
I don't really see why it's actually better, but
Who's making judgments now?
I am.
Our lecturer. Who's assessing us.
Brody.
He's going to be making quite a few judgments.
Brody, I don't think you missed any.
High score.
So I'm not going to give you an extra mark.
And you're rewarded for your loyalty by not getting one.
Matt, you have missed at least one. Sarah. Yes, you missed at least one. Skylar. Yes, you missed at least one. Peter. Yep. Claire. Technically, no, you haven't missed any, right?
Technically.
Not you. Other than.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I don't think you have because you're doing things to make up for it. Doing the subjective assessment thing. Okay. Next. Yep, you missed at least one though.
Where's Master?
And I'm not comfortable.
I feel like Matthew Smith is a really common name.
Yeah.
And of the names that you could have, one that ends with Smith and starts with a name from the Bible, probably really common.
Ishmael?
Shut up! For God's sake. You have to counterexample everything, don't you?
How many Jesus Smiths are there?
Leah. What? Zeus Smith?
How many Jesus Smiths?
Probably lots. I'm going to go with, I reckon there's lots of Jesus Smiths, because
Well,
Jesus is
more
actually
Jesus
quite a
than
common
Ishmael.
name.
Comparable names. They're similar names.
Claire Crosby. No, other Claire, sorry. Claire Abbott. I can't actually tell if this is a cross or a T, so
It's Matt Rose.
yep, you've missed at least one now. Ruby. You missed at least one, apparently. Were you there last week? No. I want to say Emily.
Chris.
I would be wrong. Sorry, Grace.
They were both female names.
That's true. Appreciate that.
You know what's weird? This role tells me whether you're married or not.
Wait,
What?
Wait,
Is
have I?
anyone in this class married?
Yes.
Really?
Or at least according to this role. Because there's at least one Mrs. in here.
Oh wait,
It's a green card marriage.
Green card marriage.
Did you take into account that I took into consideration for at least one of them?
Yes. I just think that's information I shouldn't have as to whether you're married or not. I don't care. Why does the university collect that kind of information?
It's not like a list that Cole is mad.
No, that's basically what that list is. If I can tell from Miss versus the Mrs. whether you're married, it's basically. Well, that's a fault. That's a fault with the society, not with the university's data collection. Are you married, Zach? All right.
Shouldn't be Mr. and Mr. Master. It should just be boy.
Master.
Yeah, actually, Masters are cool.
All right. Shush. Okay, so I'm going to give you some tips on on how to write an exam in philosophy? What? Yes. You're like, good, now I don't have to pay any attention. I can just sit here and think about other names for unmarried men. Okay, first piece of advice I'm going to give you. When you're preparing for your exam and you're preparing topics to talk about, to write about, look for little pockets of literature in the course outline that I've given you. There's lots of sort of extra reading in the course outline, but also just in the world in general. And find a sort of run of 3 or 4 papers that are talking to each other. And using those 3 or 4 papers, develop your exam response. So I've got 3 examples here based on stuff that we've covered in the course. I'm going to tell you how to find some of your own. Okay. First example, suppose you're interested in presentism and you're interested in the topic of truth-making. Here's a run of 3 papers that directly talk to each other. Right? There are lots of different ways you could do this because there are actually lots of different sort of small pockets of literature within the truth-making and presentism stuff. But here's a run that is particularly easy. Bigelow's Presentism and Properties paper. Then Sanson and Kaplan, who raised this worry about explanation. And then there's a paper by Giuliano Tarengo, which responds to the Sanson and Kaplan paper. Right? Get a handle on those 3 papers, and you'll be able to write an exam response that charts that debate. Right? But that's the sort of level of specificity that I want in your exam responses. Right? I want you to focus in on a particular debate in these areas and discuss it. Claire?
So we'll have to refer to people that want to
Yeah, I feel like 4 names is not super hard to remember. Yeah. I love the way you grudgingly say that. Yeah, okay. I guess I can remember 4 people's names. Look, if you can't remember their names, that's fine. I guess you can sort of have a shot at your best recollection. That might be sort of funny.
I guess San Tarengo.
I might get Biggles. We actually call him that in real life to his face sometimes. He's a really nice guy, so he can take it. Do you guys know what Biggles is? Yeah, Sarah's. Yeah, that's right. It was like there's this like series of kids' books about a fighter pilot called Biggles. Okay, second example. Suppose you're interested in time travel and interested in changing the past. You could start with Lewis's paper on the paradoxes of time travel in APQ. Then you could go for Bananas Enough for Time Travel, which is Nick Smith's paper, in which he talks about coincidences and whether or not you can change the past. And then there's a paper by Godu, I have no idea what the GC stands for. I don't know this human being. Where he challenges directly Nick's paper. Okay? Again, a short run of 3 papers that... Why is that coming up? Short run of 3 papers that you can engage with. Claire? Can you use these examples? Yes, you can use these examples. If you all use these examples, then I suppose I only have myself to blame. Because frankly, that's the most likely thing. But I would rather you use these 3 examples and get them right than not do anything like this, right? But you know, like, take it on yourselves to think about whether maybe you should look for other options, look for other literature.
Is the exam 2 papers?
Yeah, it's 2 papers. Okay, so example 3, counterfactual theories of causation. You might be interested in trumping preemption, right? This debate here is exactly over this issue, right? So you've got Lewis's paper in the Journal of Philosophy. That's the paper you're asking about, Matt, or at least the causation arm of it. Then you've got Jonathan Schaffer, who responds with trumping preemption. Then you've got Lewis's response to Schaffer's paper, causation as influence. And then you've got Schaffer's response to Lewis, causation, influence, and effluence. Okay? There's a nice little pocketed debate to dig into, right? You can write your paper on whether trumping preemption is a counterexample to counterfactual theories of causation or not, right? There's plenty to draw on here. Right? So if you want to find examples of your own, then here's how you do it. Identify a topic that you want to write on, right? So maybe you want to write on the problem of relations for presentism, say. Then look for a paper on that topic, so from the reading list or in the course outline. Put it into Google Scholar. And when you search it in Google Scholar, it will come up with the list of papers that reference that paper, that cite it, right? If you look at the papers that cite that paper, look at the cited by, right? You'll see between like 5 and 50 papers. Typically, you won't see anything like 50. It'll be much more likely. It's much more likely to be towards the lower end of that range. You'll see some papers that discuss this, and you'll see a debate. And you'll be able to pull out a little threaded debate from that cited by and turn that into an exam response. So you do it for problem of relations. You can do that for the debate over the experience of time, facing problem of experience of time for eternalism. Any of the topics that we've covered, you can dig into in this way. Okay. And I really want you to do this. You know, it shows that you can get a critical handle on a body of literature, synthesize that literature into an exam response, and then discuss it and analyze it, right? Which is those are the sort of core things that I'm looking for. Okay, next thing I want to give you advice about. Focus your answers, right? Say what you will be doing and, if necessary, what you won't be doing, right? So say you're looking at the truth-making problem for presentism and you say, look, I'm going to focus on a particular version of presentism. Biggles's tense properties presentism, right, is Lucretian presentism. I'm not going to talk about, say, Craig Bourne's ersatzer presentism or Tom Crisp's ersatzer presentism or Ross Cameron's distributional properties presentism. I'm not going to talk about any of those. I just want to focus on the Biggles version. Okay? And then you dig into that issue, right? But demarcating the space in which you're working is a really important philosophical skill, right? And by thinking about how you demarcate the space in which you're working, you will automatically start to think in a much more structured way when you're responding to questions. Okay, be specific and connect your specificity to the literature, right? So if you're going to focus on a particular version of presentism, tell me whose version of presentism it is, right? If you can remember the names. Or at least, you know, say that this is the version of presentism from the literature I'm focusing on. Okay, so here's a couple of examples. There are different versions of presentism. I will be focusing on version X as outlined by Z and which holds that Y, right? Second example, there are different versions of the truth-maker objection against presentism. I'll focus on the supervenience-based argument as outlined by Keller in that 2004 paper, right? Because there are different versions of the truth-maker argument. One of the biggest mistakes that I see in essays and exams is people who just sort of rush into a topic without adequately presenting the focus of the paper that they're writing, right? So they sort of throw themselves into the truth-maker objection without telling me what the truth-maker objection is, right, with no reflection on the fact that there are different versions of the truth-maker objection, and that's something you need to take into account when you're writing your essay, okay? So really try and be focused when you're developing these responses. Okay, this might seem like it goes without saying, but it really doesn't go without saying, sadly, for all of us. You need to argue for something in particular, right? You need to provide a thesis statement. So you won't have this memory, but in a nearby possible world, there are people in a metaphysics class who have this memory, which I think is good enough. I gave a lecture on how to write an essay in the philosophy of science course. One of the things I said about how to write a philosophy essay is it should be able to pass the party test. And the party test is the following. Suppose you're at a party and someone comes up to you and says, what's your metaphysics essay about? Right? Not a great party, but you know, you're dealing with it the best you can. You should be able to tell them in 1 or 2 sentences what your philosophy essay is about, what it is that you're arguing. If you can't do that, right, then you do not know what you're arguing and you do not have a thesis. Okay? So whenever you're arguing, thinking, how am I writing this essay, what am I doing, you need to be able to make sure that your thesis statement will pass the party test. Okay? Now, I also want you to be able to outline the structure of your argument, right? So suppose you're still at this party and someone says, well, look, that's really interesting. You're going to be talking about blur. How are you going to establish that blur, right? And then you give a very brief overview. Again, you don't want to bore the shit out of this person, right? So this is going to be, you're trying to meet the trade-off between keeping this person interested, right, and saying something interesting, right? And as soon as you, say something unclear or confused, or as soon as you start to rabbit on for a while, this person's going to get switched off and they're going to go talk to someone else in the party, and there go your chances. All right, argue for something that's narrow and manageable in the space and time available. You have an hour to write each essay, right? Depending on how fast you can write and how much you can write in an hour, and that's not a challenge, right? I don't want you to be like, well, I can write 15 pages. I used to do this when I was an undergraduate because I can write really fast, and I used to give them about 15 pages, which was probably... They did, I know that they did. They would tell me afterwards, why would you do that to us? Why? but keep a sense of how much you can write. Yeah? And make sure that the thesis that you're trying to tackle is manageable in that space and time, right? So, for example, the following thesis, probably not manageable. I'm going to argue that eternalism is false, right? It's a very focused thesis, but it's way, 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 way too ambitious, right? You won't be able to do that in an hour in an exam. What you might be able to do is say something like the following: I'm going to argue that the experience of the passage of time poses a problem for eternalism, right? Because that doesn't require that you provide a knockdown argument against eternalism, right? I mean, no one has done that yet, obviously. To think that you can do it in an exam answer is, well, sort of crazy, I think. But nevertheless, that's commonly what people do. They'll sort of provide something really ambitious and then fall over themselves to try and meet the ambitious claim that they've set out to defend. So just defend something much less ambitious, okay? Brody? All right. Okay, structure your response, right? Now, the way that I think about this, I think about this in one of two ways. One way is to imagine you're telling someone a story, right? If you're telling someone a story, so imagine you're back at this party, and someone comes up to you and they're like, tell me a story. And you've been like standing in the corner for 4 hours, so you're like, finally, human being has started to talk to me. When you're outlining the story, you can't sort of just dive in to the middle of the story, right? You have to start from the basic elements of the story, right? You have to explain the characters. You have to tell them what the characters have got going on. And then you've got to tell them about the world that the characters are living in. And then you've got to start building up a narrative structure step by step in order to take the person that you're talking to through the story that you want to tell them, right? When you're writing an essay, right, you have to outline who the characters are. The characters are probably the theories that you're going to be considering, you know, presentism, eternalism. What is it to be a presentist, right? What does that character look like? And what's the world in which they're living, right? What is the sort of dialectic space, the debate space that you're working in? What are the rules of engagement that the presentist and the eternalist have to live by, right? Maybe if you're sort of arguing that presentism is better than the growing block theory, here's one thing you don't have to do. You don't have to argue against eternalism, right? You're sort of taking for granted the dynamic picture, and then you're trying to split the difference between different dynamic theories, right? So that's a sense in which the world that you're working in might be different than the world you're working in if you're trying to attack eternalism. Okay. Yeah, Matt. No, this is just a heuristic, right? I don't want you to, like, actually tell me a story.
No, I just mean you can be incredibly parsimonious and go, presentism is this, eternalism is that.
Yeah.
You can go, presentism has been put out in this sort of form.
Yeah. Look, in an exam, right, you're under time constraints, right? So at the party, this person is going to leave unless you get them hooked, right? And to get them hooked, you're going to have to tell them the sort of, like, the most interesting things about the characters that you're dealing with. And quickly, because otherwise they're going to leave, right? And then there you go, your chances, right? So make sure that you sort of front load all of the interesting information, but do it quickly. Right? So it's sort of like a very quick story to try and make this person believe that you're someone interesting when probably, like, you know, not you personally, but just we in general as a species, not very interesting. Okay. The other way of thinking about it is, suppose you're trying to convince someone of something, right? I mean, after all, that is what we're trying to do in philosophy, is we're trying to mount arguments to convince people of the things that we're trying to argue for, right? So suppose you're at the party and someone comes up to you and says, did you know that all dogs are really cats? And you're like, let me give you an argument to the effect that that's false, right? If by the end of that discussion you haven't at least given them pause to doubt, or at least made them feel like maybe all cats aren't really dogs, then you're just not presenting a convincing argument, right? And the whole point behind presenting these arguments is to convince someone of something. And you do that step by step, right? So, okay, what is a cat? Okay, what is a dog? Right? Blah, blah, blah. Probably don't have to go much further than that. Okay, last thing. Include only those elements in your essay that you strictly require, right? And I mean, this applies to writing essays. This applies to writing anything in philosophy. When you're trying to work out which characters to include in your story, right? Don't just introduce some frivolous character that then doesn't do anything, right? That's just going to aggravate your reader. Right? What you want to do is introduce the sort of main characters that are going to be involved in the action, and only those characters, right? You want to introduce only those aspects of the world in which those characters live, right, in order for your audience to understand what you're doing. Right? And the way I think about this is, when I write, I interrogate everything that I've got in the thing that I've written, right? Do I need this? Is this essential for making my argument? If it is not essential, get rid of it. Right? Only put in the stuff that is just absolutely essential for what you're trying to say. Otherwise, you'll bore your reader. And also, it'll just become unclear. All right, so what I'm going to give you now are 3 formulas that I have used in exams in philosophy in the past that have been quite successful. Right? And I think they're very simple formulas and pretty useful as well. Okay, so first formula. The defense. First defense. Okay, first thing you do is you're going to introduce your characters, right? So you're going to introduce the sort of broad plot and the overview of the people that are involved in the plot. Then you're going to give an exegesis, right? So this is giving more detail on the things that you've introduced, right? So maybe you say what presentism is, maybe you say what eternalism is, maybe you say what time travel involves. And then you're going to do the following, right? So suppose that, in this case, you're going to argue against Biggles's tense properties view. Okay, so you've outlined his tense properties view. You said in here you're going to argue against his tense properties view. And you've also said the way that you're going to argue it. The way you're going to argue it in this case is going to proceed along the following lines. You're going to start with an objection against Biggles's view. Okay? Then you're going to respond to that objection. Then you're going to provide a counter-response to that objection. And then you're going to provide a counter-counter response to that objection. And you're going to keep doing this until you run out of time, right? And hope that you land on a defensive position. Okay? So what you want to do is, suppose you're arguing against Biggles's view, arguing in defense of Biggles's view. So there's an objection, the Sanson and Kaplan sort of explanation objection. You raise a response to that objection, right? Then you raise Giuliano Tarengo's response to your response, say, and then you provide a response to Tarengo's response, and then you're like, hey, look, we just defended the view. Okay? That's the first formula. Second formula, the attack, right? Do the same thing, but just make sure that you end on an attacking point. Okay, so suppose you're attacking Biggles's view. You raise an objection, right? The Sanson and Kaplan explanation objection. You provide a response to that objection on John's behalf. After all, you're trying to do the best job you can do and knock down the strongest theory you can. So you're going to try and protect it against the objections that you don't think are pressing so that you can, finally drive home your objection and really get the guy. So you provide a response to the Sanson and Kaplan paper. Then you provide a counter-response from Tarengo, and then you knock down Tarengo's view, and then you're like, and here it is. Here's the problem. And then you outline your final objection, right? And then you're done. Okay? So what you do when you're doing this is you take that little pocketed body of literature, right, which is a debate between, debate between Sanson and Kaplan and Bigelow and Giuliano Tarengo, and you synthesize the back and forth between those positions that is captured within that little run of papers, and then you lay it out for the most part, right? Biggles, Tarengo, Sanson and Kaplan, right? And then, if you're lucky, if you work hard enough and you think real hard, maybe you can add something at the end of that back and forth, right? Why is it that you think Sanson and Kaplan's objection doesn't ultimately work? Or why is it that you think that Tarengo's objection ultimately doesn't work, right? If you can't add anything, oh well, right? It is, after all, an undergraduate philosophy course, right? And you're learning this for the first time, right? Just tracking this debate of back and forth between these people is enough to show that you understand the literature and that you can sort of see the critical points and show how they fit together in a meaningful and useful way. Sure, you can use I. I use it all the time. In an exam? God, no. Don't waste any time doing something that you don't need to do. So don't bother with headings. I mean, you can use them if you want. If you have a special sort of love for headings. I know some people do. Right? But yeah, you don't need to use headings. I mean, the only time you would need to use headings, I suppose, is if the structure of your argument is not clear.
and you feel that you don't know how to make it clear, so you're going to use headings to sort of clarify the joints in the argument, right? Then you might use headings, but just using headings for the sake of headings is not really needed. Yeah. 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 Use signposting. It's always better to use signposting. Okay, I've done the first thing, right? I just showed you the first part of this argument. Now you start with, there are 3 parts to my argument. I'm going to go through them one by one. Then you go through the first one. You say, okay, that was the first part, right? Now I'm on to the second part. Then you go through the second part. You say, okay, good, the second part. Now we're on to the third part. You do the third part, and you're like, and we're done, right? And as long as you have these little signposts throughout the paper that say, look, this is what I'm doing now, this is what I'm going to do next, this is what I did previously, and so on, then I will be able to follow what you're doing, right? Headings are at best a sort of way of not doing that, but I think it's always better to just say what you're doing. Yeah. All right, the defense, the second defense. Okay, there are lots of ways that you could build these formulas once you start thinking about it, right? This is the second way of doing the defense, and you can kind of see trivially there's going to be an attacking version of this. So you introduce what it is that you're going to do. You're going to say, I'm going to argue against Lucretian presentism, right, against Biggles's view. And I'm going to do that by outlining 3 serious objections and showing you that they are good objections and that the view falls to these 3 objections, right? Then what do? You outline Biggles's view, and then you go, objection 1. Oh, sorry, this is defense. Sorry, we're defending Biggles's view. I'm going to defend Biggles's view, right, by knocking down all of the objections, or 3 main objections, 3 principal objections. You outline his view, and then you give objection, and then you respond. And you give an objection, then you respond. You do the back and forth. And what you can do is, using that little pocketed literature, you can take the objections and the responses from that literature, right? So you've got Sanson and Kaplan objection, then you've got a Tarango response. You've got Ted Sider's cheating objection, and then you've got a response. You've got an objection I've raised against them that you need necessitation, and then you've got, or aboutness, and then you've got a response. And you can pull in a lot of material in that way, show that you've got your head around a fair chunk of the debate, and you've defended something in a coherent and focused way, right? Okay, when you're doing this, though, it is good to, as much as you can, try and show that your objections and replies form a sort of natural structure, right? That you're not just picking like 3 random things and then talking about them. That these are sort of 3 related objections. Maybe they're 3 ways of sort of trying to get at a central problem that this view faces, right? Or maybe they're 3 sort of versions of the same objection, right, that 3 different people have put up, but you think that all 3 versions fail, right? It's better to make sure that there's some relationship between the objections than just give me 3 random objections. Although if you did just give me 3 random objections and show how they can be responded to, that would still be pretty good. All right, so here's some bad exam responses, some things to avoid. The Wanderer. The Wanderer has no thesis. The Wanderer does not need a thesis. The Wanderer is above such things. The Wanderer just discusses a range of topics with little to no coherence, right? So they might give me an essay which just sort of like outlines all of the dynamic theories of time and then concludes. And I'm like, okay, cool. Thanks for wandering around like that. The uncritical shopper. The uncritical shopper just sort of outlines all of the objections against a view with no critical reflection on those objections, right? So like, I'm going to talk about Lucretian presentism, and I'm going to tell you 15 objections against that view, and then they just go through one after another, right? Look, I mean, I get why there's a sort of temptation to do that. It's easy to do that, and in some sense, it's sort of like what we do in philosophy. We just sort of throw objections at things. It's not... Unless you're sort of reflecting on whether those objections are good objections, you're just not engaging critically with the material. At best, you're just telling me what other people have said without reflecting on its critical value. Okay? The regurgitator, not the band. They outline the content of a lecture or a paper blow by painful blow. Right? Don't. The Pretender. The Pretender is perhaps the most exciting to read and the most enjoyable in a lot of ways, but typically does not do well in their exams. The Pretender just makes things up, right? No, sorry, this is a hangover from the Phil Tsai version of this. They say, make up a version of presentism, right? Right off the bat. They're like, here's presentism. I haven't really read anything about it. But here's what I think it should be. Right? And then they give me that. And then they proceed to discuss that at length. And I'm usually just making stuff up as they go along, right? That doesn't make much sense. I mean, what the pretender is really doing is just generally trying to pretend to me that they've actually prepared for this exam, right? The thing is, I can see through it very easily as to whether someone's prepared for an exam or not. And so, I mean, by all means, make things up. Philosophy is about making things up, right? But link them to the literature. Situate them in the ongoing debate, right? So, you know, you might look at the problem of relations for presentism. You might go through some problems with various views, like with a particular view that's been offered, and then offer a new way to solve that problem, right, which you've just made up. Fine, good, do it, right? Don't just make everything up from go to woe, right? All right, the last person, and the last one, I suspect, is also the most dangerous and the most pernicious and the one that traps us all at some point. This is the prisoner. The prisoner gets overly caught up in trying to answer the question, right? When you see a question in philosophy, I don't know if this generalizes to other disciplines. I suspect it probably does. When you see a question in philosophy, take it as an invitation to say something about the topic mentioned in the question, right? Don't get bogged down in trying to obsessively answer the question in the following way. You write a paragraph. You relate it back to how it answers the question. You write another paragraph. At the end of that paragraph, you say, oh, this answers the question too. And then at the third paragraph, you say something, and then at the end of that paragraph, you say also how that answers the question, right? And like you're just constantly like sort of trapped obsessively with the question. You don't need to be trapped obsessively with the question, right? If you write an essay, right? So say there's a question on presentism, right? And you write an essay on presentism, right? And it's a good essay, and it doesn't exactly address the question. Oh well. I would prefer to read a good essay on something in the neighborhood than a terrible essay that's obsessively trying to like answer this deep question that I've asked, right? These are just prompts for getting you to write essays. Don't take them too seriously. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I mean, you don't just conclude like that. You start like that, right? You say, I'm going to look at presentism, right? I'm going to show you that on balance, this version of presentism does better. Now, I can't establish this beyond reasonable doubt, right? But still, I think that there's an important case to be made here, and I'm going to make that case. As long as you're upfront about what it is that you're doing, then it's fine to have sort of weaker, hedgier conclusions like that. In fact, if you look at any philosophy paper, you'll find something like this. They'll be like, they'll sort of, like the title will be like, you know, something grandiose, and then the introduction will be this glorious display of hedging. Here's what I'm not going to do. Here's this other thing I'm not going to do. And don't get me wrong, nothing here is actually true, right? It's just sort of a way of thinking about things. I mean, philosophy is shot through with this. Just make, it's useful to know, right? Otherwise, people will misinterpret you. They'll think, oh, they're arguing for this really strong thing, but they haven't shown that really strong thing, right? No, you just say, I'm not arguing for the strong thing. I'm arguing for this weaker thing, but the weaker thing is still interesting for these reasons. Okay. All right, avoiding the bad. To avoid the wanderer, argue for something and have a particular structure to your paper. To avoid the uncritical shopper, consider responses and counter-responses to objections and use the literature to do this. Okay? To avoid the regurgitator, use these pockets of literature to inform and structure your exam response. Right? To avoid the pretender, study for your exam. Okay? Don't just make shit up. And to avoid the prisoner, take the question as an invitation to write an essay on a particular topic. Don't worry too much about completely answering the question. Okay? All right, last thing is a piece of pragmatic advice about when you're actually preparing for an exam. What I used to do is I used to take these bodies of literature and I used to make up questions that I thought might be asked, right? So I'd be like, what's a question that might be asked? Well, very general question that might be asked is argue for presentism or argue for a particular form of presentism, say, right? Let's suppose that that question gets asked. What I might do is I might get a body of literature, develop a structured essay out of that body of literature by using a mind map, right? So it'll be like, okay, here's the version of presentism, here are the objections, here are the responses. Now I can trace this line through that mind map, and I can use that line to formulate an essay, right? And then you sit down, give yourself an hour, and write the essay. Okay? If you do this 3 times for, like, you prepare 3 topics, right, and you have a go at writing the essay in an hour for each topic, you will find the exam so much easier to do when you get in there, right? Because rote learning things is the worst way, in my opinion, to prepare for an exam. The way to prepare for an exam is to encode things like semantically by sort of understanding the information and to actually go through the process of writing the thing out in an exam condition. I used to know people when I was an undergraduate who would memorize entire essays, word for word, and then get into an exam and just write the thing out. I mean, this was a stunning piece of memory usage, right? But just such a complete waste of time, right? You just remember the structure, right? You don't need to remember the exact phraseology. You don't need to remember the exact wording. Just need to remember the structure, the arguments, the responses, the objections, the theories, and then use that structure to write an essay when you get in there. Go ahead.
If we, for our main, like, independent article, our main 50% essay, wrote it on some time, can we still write an essay in the exam all the time?
No double dipping, okay? So you can't write on the same topic that you wrote your essay on, okay? So if you wrote on time, then you can't write on time in the exam. If you wrote on causation, then you can't write on causation in the exam. And the reason for this is because I want you to be able to learn at least 2 things in the course, right? I don't want you to just know stuff about time. I want you to know some stuff about time and some stuff about causation. And if you're forced to write an exam response on both, then I hope that you'll at least learn a little bit of the literature on both topics. Okay? All right, these are your exam topics. You will get a question, at least 1 question on time, at least 1 question on causation, and at least 1 question on time travel, right? I will say this. You will have to answer a question on time travel. Okay? I mean, just think about it. If you can't double dip, then you're going to have to write an essay on time travel. Okay? In the course, yeah. In the context of the course, you have to write something on each. That would be fun to read, but I wouldn't stake your marks on it.
That would be the pretender of just like fantastic proportions.
Yeah. Yes, Claire.
So you'll have to write each of your essay exams on each of the 2 topics you essay?
Yeah, that's right. Well, although there were no questions on time travel in the essays. Yeah. Okay. That's it. That's all I've got. Any other questions? Where's your prize? I gave you that calculator. What more do you want? Yeah, I haven't worked it out yet. I'm pretty sure.
So to clarify, more or less stole something.
No, I bought that calculator and gave it to Claire. I mean, come on. What do you take me for? Some calculator stealing charlatan?
Someone was intending sarcasm that wasn't taken that way.
It wasn't my calculator. I didn't care. I mean, technically, she stole it.
Has that been recorded?
All right.
Well, technically she stole it.
All right. Any other questions? No? All right. Good luck. Yep. Why? No more workshops. That's it. The end of metaphysics. Yes.
I've been doing it on the
Probably not
any
right.
explanation that it doesn't positive.
This is not complete truth.
Yeah, no, I'm picking up from that likely the
It does. But then you've got questions about
Yeah, I would.
to what end are they putting
Yeah.
these examples, right? And the problem with the pragmatic theory of explanation, the sort of issue you have to deal with in that case is, well, if you're trying to defend the use of ex-mathematical explanation as people like Baker use it, right? Then the problem with pragmatism is that threatens to undercut the realist attitude that people have towards these things. Right? Because pragmatic theory is explanation, sort of anti-realist. Now Baker says, well, look, maybe you could have a realist theory of pragmatic explanation, but he doesn't tell you what that is. Okay? So the challenge would be to tell me what that is.
So I'm sort of going to be sort of saying explicitly, look, I don't care whether or not this supports mathematical realism or not. I'm just.
But then you have to think about whether it's interesting to talk about. Like, then you have to find some reasons for why it is that we should care about mathematical explanation independently of that debate.
I'm not sure it's so much care of it independently. It should be whether or not mathematical entities should be established independently of that debate. At the moment, it's just people are putting forward arguments purely for the purpose of trying to use mathematical explanation to either justify or refute someone else's approach to mathematical realism. So the Platonists are all lining up and saying mathematical explanation exists and it justifies entities, and all the Gnostics are lining up and going, no, mathematical explanation doesn't exist, or it does exist, but it doesn't justify this entity. I sort of want to go, okay, just calm down for a second. Let's look and see if it looks like it exists independently of the
Have a
debate.
look at the paper by a guy called Mark Lange.
Mark Lang.
Lange. I'm pretty sure it's on the course outline. He's talking about mathematical explanation independently of that debate and trying to give a theory of it.
Okay.
So that would be a good starting point.
Grace.
Yes.
Not Emily.
No. Somewhat self-deprecating question. If I were to hand in my assignment first thing Monday,
Yeah.
how much marks would I lose? Do you know?
You wouldn't lose any because we extended it till Friday next week.
What's Friday this week?
Oh, sorry, Friday this week.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm confused.
But if
how
you
much
want to
would-
extend it,
No, I can't. How much